everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today's video is all about all of the books that I read in 2021. This is my year in reading. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books. And last year I read more books in a year than I've ever done in my life. So I thought that as I wasn't on Booktube for the entirety of that year, I would show you every book I read this year and try to just give you one sentence or less on every single book. So before we get into this, this is my first sort of review of the year type of video. My second will be my top 10. And so I thought I would put the statistics into this video. This year I read 122 books in total, and that is 36,691 pages according to Goodreads, although the story graph, which I've not properly used this year, not always kept it up to date, had a slightly different number, but I think we'll go with this one because I usually pick the editions that I am reading for sure on Goodreads. So that was pretty amazing to me. I almost doubled the Goodreads goal that I had, which was 62 books. And I never expected to do that, so it's only really down to Booktube that I actually did it. So a little bit of stats first. 27 of those books were audiobooks that I listened to. 70 books were off the Giant TBR, which is excellent. 10 were rereads. 10 were borrowed, either from the library or usually my mum. 4 were in collections, so they were either in my complete works of Shakespeare or my collected works of Oscar Wilde, so they weren't just a standalone book on their own. And 1 at the very last minute was an ebook, and that was because I read some poetry in December, which I read as an ebook. I don't usually read any ebooks in a year, but every now and then one creeps in. So the rest were all physical apart from the 27 audio. So I won't show you how that breaks down for every single month because that's been included in wrap-up videos. And what I'll do as I go along and get into the books with you is I will try and put a title on the bottom here to tell you which month I read these books in, so that if you wanted to go and check out a more detailed description of any books, you'll find them in the relevant monthly wrap-ups. From April onwards, that is, because before April I wasn't on Booktube. So some of the sentences that I give you might be a bit longer, January to April, but will be generally much shorter from there on in because I've spoken about them elsewhere. But without any further ado, let's get into the 122 books I read in 2021. Because I'm summarising them so briefly, I may say comments that you disagree with, that's fine. Chat to me in the comments down below. I'd love to hear if you enjoyed these books or not. The other thing to note is that I'll be trying to hold up and show you the book. I have got nearly 122 books here. If it was an audiobook, obviously I'll show a picture, and I'll also show a picture if I've already unhauled it or if for some reason I haven't got the book here. Here are all of the books I read in 2021. And in the first couple of months I am going to show you the actual physical copy of Sherlock Holmes books, but I did actually listen to all of these Sherlock Holmes books on audio. I just thought I'd show them to you as I have them. So I kicked off the year with The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. This is my favourite of the Holmes short stories. Postern of Fate was next up. This was the final Agatha Christie that I was reading for the first time around, and it's also the final mystery that Agatha Christie wrote. Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes. These are more great Sherlock Holmes short stories. The Last Dog on Earth is a brilliant post-apocalyptic book about a man and his dog. The Return of Sherlock Holmes is a fine return to short stories for Sherlock Holmes. Agatha Christie's Murder in the Making by John Curran is a fascinating book about Agatha Christie's notebooks. The Valley of Fear is, in my opinion, half a good Holmes adventure and half take it or leave it backstory. And The Thursday Murder Club was a really fun book that did tail off a bit at the end for me, but I enjoyed it. Lying Room by Nikki French, enjoyable and suspenseful. Deep Blue by Jacqueline Wilson was me revisiting a childhood favourite that I remembered, and it was okay, it was still good. His Last Bow by Arthur Conan Doyle is not really as good as the others, but I did like the stories told by Sherlock Holmes himself. And The Casebook of Sherlock Holmes is probably my least favourite collection of Holmes short stories, but they are Holmes short stories nonetheless. The Lantern Men by Ellie Griffiths is a really exciting Ruth Galloway story. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens was fascinating, gripping and scary, an absolute favourite. The Nighthawks by Ellie Griffiths was another great Ruth Galloway. I loved some of the developments in this one. Criminal by Karen Slaughter is a well-written dual timeline book in the Will Trent series. The Zigzag Girl by Ellie Griffiths. I enjoyed the magician themes during this post-World War II set mystery. Deadly Decisions by Kathy Reichs, one of my least favourite books of the year. Next up we have Night School by Lee Child, which just caused a massive avalanche of books, which I've probably cut out. And this is another good Reacher adventure from his army days. Court by Harlan Coben was an enjoyable thriller, but I've pretty much forgotten it now. Help the Witch is full of excellent short stories, especially my absolute favourite, Just Good Friends, which I would read this collection again just for that one. Behind the Scenes at the Museum by Kate Atkinson is a great debut from Kate Atkinson with Shades of Life After Life, her later book. Smoke and Mirrors by Ellie Griffiths was not as enjoyable for me as the first Mephisto and Stevens, which I'd already listened to, but it was fine. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson is a sci-fi dystopian classic with vampires that is very desolate and despairing, but such a good read. Madame Zero by Sarah Hall is another book of short stories, and these ones are absolutely bizarre. The Guest List by Lucy Foley had one of the best first chapters I read all year, but there was too much of suspension of disbelief required for the rest of the book. Persuasion by Jane Austen made me realise why people love Jane Austen. It's an absolutely brilliant book. My Sister the Serial Killer by Oyinkan Braithwaite was not what I was expecting, but it was a great short novel nonetheless. The Wasteland and Other Poems by T.S. Eliot is brilliant and bizarre. Animal Farm by George Orwell was a really fun audiobook, and I loved the cyclical nature of the plot. Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway was very disappointing and had no characters I cared for. Anne of Green Gables by Ellen Montgomery is such a wonderful, heartwarming and happy book. Sweet Danger by Marjorie Allingham was a very strangely disjointed mystery. The Rose and the Yew Tree by Mary Westmacott. This was my first that I've read of the Mary Westmacott novels, and nothing much happened, but I loved it. The Lost World by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Not enough dinosaurs in it for me. 1984 by George Orwell. I was so disappointed. I think I had overhyped this book to myself for years. A Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett is a really beautiful, heartwarming and sad story. The Franchise Affair by Josephine Tey was not as entertaining as I thought it would be, but it was okay. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. It was lovely to revisit this book from childhood. Clouds of Witness by Dorothy L. Sayers was a mildly interesting Lord Peter Wimsey mystery. The Inimitable Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse, such a fun listen on audiobook. The House of Sleep by Jonathan Coe, a pretty bizarre book featuring lots of people with different sleep problems. Gravity by Tess Gerritsen, an extremely gruesome space adventure. Written in Bone by Simon Beckett, another thriller that I have largely forgotten, but I know it was set on a Scottish island. Skeleton Crew by Stephen King. Some of these stories were a bit much for me, but the ones that weren't, I really enjoyed, and I would like to read more Stephen King next year. Carry On Jeeves by P.G. Wodehouse was even funnier than the previous Jeeves book, and a really enjoyable listen. True History of the Kelly Gang by Peter Carey. I really struggled with this one. I'm not good at reading prize-winning books. Beggar's Banquet by Ian Rankin was a fun series of short stories, not all of them featuring his detective Rebus. Moon Dust by Andrew Smith is a really enjoyable non-fiction book all about the men who went to the moon. The Earthsat's Elevator by Lemony Snicket, another fun book in the series of unfortunate events. The Vile Village by Lemony Snicket. Really enjoying being back to reading this series. It's so much fun. The Hostile Hospital by Lemony Snicket was a lot darker than the previous two, but still enjoyable in places. Past Tense by Lee Child was another hard-hitting Jack Reacher thriller. Right Ho Jeeves, the third P.G. Wodehouse book I listened to this year, was really funny too. Shadow and Bone by Leigh Bardugo. I enjoyed this start to the Shadow and Bone series. Her Fearful Symmetry by Audrey Niffenegger. I was so disappointed with this book and would probably put it down as my least favourite of the year. Peril at End House by Agatha Christie. This was my first reread with Christie Fest. Mansfield Park by Jane Austen was a read-along in Jane Austen July, and I absolutely enjoyed it. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. A long overdue read for me, and I loved it. Let the Right One In by John Ajvide Lindqvist. A very strange, dark and disturbing vampire tale. Ring the Hill by Tom Cox was one of my favourites of the year, a beautiful book of nature writing. The next book was called Get Out of Town by Mikol Osto, and it was a Riverdale TV series tie-in that I really shouldn't have wasted my time reading. The Blindfold by Siri Hustvedt reads more like a series of short stories, but I really enjoyed it nonetheless. Emma by Jane Austen was a lovely way to round out Jane Austen July, and I found it hilarious. Siege and Storm by Leigh Bardugo was another audiobook that I probably didn't find as enjoyable as book 1 or book 3, but it was fun anyway. A Caribbean Mystery by Agatha Christie is the first Miss Marple that I reread, and I enjoyed it even more on the second time. Why Didn't They Ask Evans was another reread, and this one I had forgotten the entire plot to, so I really enjoyed it. Ruin and Rising by Leigh Bardugo rounded out the Shadow and Bone trilogy really nicely, and I loved the way it tied up all of the ends. Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon was a really enjoyable Victorian novel with lots of suspense and intrigue. Rebecca was a really enjoyable buddy read that I thought I'd read years ago, but I actually hadn't, and I'm so glad I got to it this year. No Time for Goodbye by Linwood Barclay was one of my least favourite thrillers I read this year, and I didn't even really care about the resolution of the mystery. Are These My Bazoomas I See Before Me by Louise Renison, the final book in the Georgia Nicholson series, was hilarious as always. Theodore Boone by John Grisham was a fairly forgettable courtroom drama with a teenager as the protagonist. Othello by William Shakespeare was a great way back into enjoying Shakespeare on my own for the first time. Bookworm by Lucy Mangan is one of my absolute top favourites from this year, and it's an amazing book about books. Mrs McGinty's Dead was another reread, and I really enjoyed this one. The Tempest by William Shakespeare. I really enjoyed some of the themes in this, but it took me a little bit of time to get into. New Boy by Tracy Chevalier was a very strange adaptation of Othello that just didn't quite work for me. Agatha Christie, an autobiography. I was so pleased to finally read this, and my only disappointment is that she didn't talk about her writing as much as I would have liked. Agatha, The Real Life of Agatha Christie by Anne Martinetti, Guillaume Lebeau and Alexandra Frank is a graphic biography of the Queen of Crime, which was very enjoyable. The Shakespeare Curse by J.L. Carroll was a fairly forgettable thriller with some Shakespeare themes. The Winter's Tale by William Shakespeare. I really enjoyed reading this to round out Shakestember. Nothing Like the Sun by Anthony Burgess was a huge disappointment to me, and I really struggled through the book and didn't really enjoy any aspect of it. Raffles by E.W. Hornung. For me, this isn't as good as Sherlock Holmes, but it was okay. Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. I struggled to get into this one compared to the Shadow and Bone trilogy, but it was really enjoyable, and I will listen to the rest of the series. The Mirror Cracked from Side to Side was another enjoyable reread, but I did remember the key plot point in this one. Hawksmoor by Peter Ackroyd was a really bizarre postmodern novel that I enjoyed, but wasn't sure if I understood the ending. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte was such a brilliant surprise. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, a really good short novella with lots of different themes to get hold of. Gothic Tales by Elizabeth Gaskell, a really mixed bag of short stories for me. Halloween Party by Agatha Christie, another reread, and this isn't one of my favourites of hers, but it's fun to read in October. The Signalman by Charles Dickens, a really spooky short story that I highly recommend. Halloween Party graphic novel by Agatha Christie and Chandra. I don't love the graphics in this one, but it's still a fun read. Wilder's Hand by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, a pretty hefty book that didn't need to be as long as it was. The Walking Dead Volume 1, Days Gone By, an excellent graphic novel that I will definitely be looking out for the rest of the series. Fight Club by Chuck Palahniuk, brilliant. The A to Z of Everything by Debbie Johnson, a really pleasant surprise and a fun book to read in one day. What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, a fascinating memoir about writing and running. Murder on the Orient Express remains one of my absolute top favourite Agatha Christie's, and this read showed me how much I absolutely love it. Come Tell Me How You Live by Agatha Christie Malawan is an interesting archaeological memoir about digs and living in Syria. The Art of Racing in the Rain by Garth Stein absolutely broke me, but such a wonderful story narrated by an amazing dog called Enzo. Friend Request by Laura Marshall, a pretty throwaway thriller that I listened to on audiobook. Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut, not one I would revisit again, just didn't really do much for me. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, a really interesting take on a future dystopia where book burning is a thing. Notebook by Tom Cox, another fantastic non-fiction, this one made up of short pieces. The Furthest Station by Ben Aronovich, a really good novella in the Rivers of London series. Cleaning the Gold by Karen Slaughter and Lee Child, a matchup between Will Trent and Jack Reacher that probably could have been much better than it was. The Santa Claus Murder by Mavis Doriel Hay, a not very Christmassy Christmas mystery that I didn't enjoy that much. Dear Reader by Kathy Renson-Brink, an absolutely amazing book all about books and life. The Day of the Triffids by John Wyndham, another cool post-apocalyptic fiction, this time featuring deadly plants. A Fatal Grace by Louise Penny, the first book in the Inspector Gamache series, and I enjoyed it. Giant's Bread by Mary Westmacott, a bit long for my taste, but it did have some very interesting plot points. Footsteps in the Dark by Georgette Heyer, a really enjoyable Christmas mystery with such fun elements. The Sitterford Mystery by Agatha Christie. I didn't actually enjoy this as much the second time round as I did on my first read. Agatha Raisin, A Spoonful of Poison by MC Beaton. A pretty throwaway plot that I've already forgotten even though I only read it a couple of weeks ago. 450 from Paddington, one of my favourite Miss Marple mysteries. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I can't believe I had never read this before, and I will now be reading it every single Christmas as it made me feel so happy. The Killings at Kingfisher Hill by Sophie Hannah. I really like Inspector Catchpole in Sophie Hannah's reimagining of Poirot, but the mystery in this one wasn't amazing. The Invisible Host by Gwen Bristow and Bruce Manning. An interesting mystery in which several people are killed. Lyrical Ballads by Samuel Taylor Coleridge and William Wordsworth. The second poetry collection I read this year, and I didn't particularly enjoy many of the poems in it. The Iliad by Homer. I'm so glad that I finally read this ancient classic. And finally, the 122nd book, we've made it. Young Sherlock Holmes, Red Leech by Andrew Lane. Not a patch on the real Sherlock Holmes books, but quite a fun adventure. That brings me to the end of the 122 books I've read this year. We've only had 2 book avalanches. The cat's run away twice, but we made it through all of the books, and I hope you enjoyed this little look at everything that I read over the past year. If you'd like to drop me a message in the comments about any of the books you've heard about today, please do. And as I said, you can find more about all of the books from April onwards by looking back at any of my wrap-ups from those months. I don't think I'll ever try to wrap up 122 books in a video again. I've learned my lesson, But I hope you enjoyed the video anyway, and if you did, I hope you'll give it a like, and I hope you will subscribe and consider sticking around if you haven't already. And I'll hope to see you all again soon in another video all about books here on Alice on the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now. Sorry Harry, are you alright? You okay?